the use of asbestos-containing products dropped way down in the United States after OSHA started proposing regulations in the early 1970s, even though we haven't banned it and it is still in use. We no longer have the massive industrial exposures that we used to have of insulators, construction workers, people building ships, building high-rise buildings, spraying on asbestos insulation, installing asbestos pipe covering and block insulation, and so on, which really drove the early years of the litigation. But a lot of those products are still in place and have to be removed or modified when repairs are done. There was a lot of asbestos used on drywall, sheetrock, joint compounds, and so on that was sanded, and it may be perfectly safe when it's sitting on a wall covered with 3 layers of paint. But as people do home remodeling or demolish buildings, that's going to generate exposure. These exposures are not at the level that they once were, and they may not occur as often as they once did. But in general, all exposures to asbestos can contribute to an increased risk of the development of disease, and in particular of mesothelioma. The problem is that even a very low increased risk, when multiplied by millions or tens of millions of people, can mean that some real number of people will become sick. It may not be in the thousands like we've seen up till the present, but the best estimates are that we will continue to see significant measurable numbers of mesothelioma deaths in this country from exposure to asbestos well into the middle of this century. And these tend to come from stranger, more unusual kinds of occupations or even non-occupational exposure. We see cases involving people who did their own brake jobs, maybe 2 or 3 or 5 times in the course of their lives, what we call shade tree mechanics, folks who did this work in their backyards. We see cases of people whose exposure was that when they were kids, they helped dad work on the car. There aren't very many of these, but they happen. We see cases of all kinds of kind of strange exposures. A kid who went to work with his dad on Saturdays, and his dad worked in an airplane hangar while guys were working on airplanes that had asbestos-containing parts. It wasn't a great exposure, but it could be enough to increase the risk. And the interesting thing about risk is that's prospective. It's looking to predict the future. Once the disease happens, it's not a question of risk anymore. It becomes a question of cause. And anything that has contributed to an increase of risk, once the development happens and it's there, you have to look at all of those factors that contributed to the risk as being a part of the cause. So we see cases that come up in ways that we've never seen before, or at least that in comparison with the huge numbers of traditional shipyard and construction worker cases we saw before, maybe weren't noticed quite as much. But now, as the numbers of mesothelioma cases from the old kinds of exposures get reduced with the passage of time, these stranger cases are becoming far less strange. They're becoming, in a sense, more typical. It's not unusual for us to see these cases, and in fact, most of the cases we see today are what we would have called strange or unusual. I guess now that makes them the usual kind of case.